The fog hung low over the cobblestone streets of Berlin, swallowing the gaslight's warm glow and turning the familiar avenues into twisting, spectral corridors. The air was thick with the faint scent of coal smoke, mingling with the distant echo of a church bell tolling with an almost accusatory rhythm. Pedestrians hurried along, coats drawn tight, umbrellas shaking off the drizzle, yet there was a strange hush beneath the ordinary bustle, a whisper that something unseen had begun to take hold in the city. Whispers had always traveled fast in Berlin, especially the kind that seemed too terrible, too uncanny to be fully believed, and this one had roots that stretched into the narrow alleys and silent courtyards of the old district. They spoke of a priest, a man whose eyes were said to hold a strange, penetrating clarity, a man who claimed to see beyond the veil that separated life from death. He had arrived quietly, unassuming at first, performing the customary rites and offering the comfort expected of his office. Yet in hushed corners, his reputation had begun to grow, slowly, inexorably, as tales emerged that the faithful could not fully dismiss. It was said he could count souls as though they were coins, enumerating each presence with a precision that defied reason. Children murmured the phrase to one another, adults pressed their lips together to hide uncertainty, and the city's clergy exchanged uneasy glances behind closed doors. No one could say exactly when the fear began, but it was as if the streets themselves had grown aware of him, the cobbles echoing with a quiet, almost imperceptible dread, a rhythm that matched the tolling bell and the steady, deliberate pace of his steps. At first, it was nothing more than curiosity, the kind of fascination that arises when a stranger comes bearing knowledge too strange to ignore. Parishioners reported noticing small peculiarities. The priest's eyes would linger too long on those leaving confession, his ledger always open, notes taken with meticulous care. He asked questions that seemed innocent, yet carried an uncanny weight, probing the lives of his flock in ways that stirred both reverence and unease. The old women who swept the church floors whispered among themselves, describing the quiet precision with which he moved, the way he seemed to count every candle and align every pew with mathematical devotion. One man, a local watchmaker, claimed to have glimpsed him standing in the rain at midnight, tallying the footsteps of passers-by as though they were items in some invisible ledger. These accounts were dismissed by some as exaggeration, by others as the natural fears of an unsettled populace, but they spread nonetheless, as insistent and penetrating as the damp mist that clung to the city. The city itself seemed to respond to his presence. Narrow alleys that had once felt merely shadowed now appeared sinister, their corners populated by imagined figures and long, unidentifiable noises. The lamplight would dance across walls in peculiar ways, as though the darkness itself were counting, following, recording. Children grew restless, waking with cries that spoke of incomprehensible visions, while adults felt a creeping sensation of being observed, measured, and catalogued. Conversations dropped into silence when his name was mentioned, and a subtle tension threaded through cafes, markets, and tram cars. People could not quite place what was wrong, and yet an instinctive knowledge told them that something fundamental had shifted in the rhythm of their city. Even those who claimed not to believe in superstition felt an uncomfortable tightening in the chest, a sense that the ordinary rules of life were bending in subtle, unexplainable ways. Stories began to converge on small, uncanny events. A baker claimed that every morning he would find coins rearranged in his shop, not stolen, but meticulously placed in patterns that mirrored the number of parishioners who had died that week. A seamstress spoke of threads unraveling in unusual sequences, forming shapes that seemed to echo the priest's ledger. These tales, seemingly disconnected, grew into a lattice of unease, reinforcing the notion that Father Albrecht's presence was more than mundane. It was not mere fear that gripped the people but a slow, persistent dread, the kind that seeps into daily life and distorts perception, making shadows seem heavier, silence more profound, and every action part of a hidden pattern. The rational mind struggled to interpret these phenomena, but the imagination required little effort. In Berlin, where history lingered in every brick and every archway, the city itself became a witness, holding memory and superstition in equal measure, allowing the legend of the priest to take root. By nightfall, even those who had dismissed the stories found themselves reconsidering. The tolling bell seemed louder, its vibrations thrumming through the walls of their homes, resonating with some unspoken rhythm. Windows reflected shapes that were not there, and in those reflections, the faint outline of a man, ledger in hand, watching, counting, measuring. The distinction between reality and imagination blurred, for the city had become complicit in the priest's mystery. People reported waking in the early hours, certain they had heard faint numbers whispered through the mist, counting, counting, counting. It was as if Berlin itself had begun to participate in his ritual, the gas lamps and cobblestones transformed into instruments of quiet horror. Even the air seemed thick with attention, as if the unseen was aware of those who doubted, of those who slept unaware. The emotional landscape of the city shifted imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. Fear and fascination intertwined, creating a tension that would not be easily undone. And in the midst of this growing unease, Father Albrecht walked the streets with calm authority, appearing in the periphery of everyday life, never intrusive, yet impossible to ignore. To the casual observer, he was a priest performing his duties, a man of piety and devotion. But to those attuned to the subtler currents of the city, he was something else entirely, a figure straddling the boundary between the ordinary and the impossible. The narrative tension of his presence set the stage for events that would escalate from whispers and oddities to outright fear, laying the foundation for the chilling story that would envelop Berlin. This was not merely the story of a man, but of a city slowly realizing that the very act of counting, of observing, could take on a weight beyond comprehension, that the value of a soul could be measured, and that in some hands, the ledger of life was not an abstraction, but a terrifying certainty. Berlin at the turn of the century was a city of contrasts, a place where industrial ambition collided with the lingering shadows of superstition and old-world belief. The streets buzzed with horse-drawn carriages, early automobiles, and the rhythmic clatter of trams weaving between monumental stone buildings and narrow, twisting alleyways. Smoke from factories curled into the low-hanging clouds, mingling with the scent of coal fires from the tenements, creating an atmosphere both vibrant and oppressive. In these streets, the lives of ordinary citizens unfolded against a backdrop of rapid change. Merchants counted their ledgers and weighed their coins, families whispered prayers over candlelit dinners, and laborers marched to the mechanical rhythm of factories, unaware that the invisible threads of fear and fascination were beginning to entwine around them. The social landscape of Berlin was equally complex. Wealth and privilege existed alongside poverty and neglect, creating a fertile ground for rumor and unease. Grand boulevards and ornate churches stood in stark contrast to the cramped apartments and narrow stairwells where whispers of Father Albrecht's peculiar abilities first began to circulate. These rumors did not arise in a vacuum, they thrived in a city accustomed to dualities. Rational thought, inspired by burgeoning science and philosophy, coexisted uneasily with superstition, folklore, and the lingering fear of unseen forces. Berliners were no strangers to mystery, for the city had long carried the weight of history in its stones, the Prussian monarchy, revolutionary uprisings, and centuries of religious tension left marks that could never be fully erased. It was within this liminal space between progress and tradition that Father Albrecht found fertile ground for his strange claims, a place where fear could be rationalized as piety and curiosity could blur into obsession. Life in the neighborhood surrounding Father Albrecht's parish was a study in contrasts. The streets were narrow, uneven, and often shrouded in mist, creating shadows that seemed to twist with their own intent. Families lived in buildings that had stood for generations, their walls soaked with memory, their halls echoing with laughter, prayer, and occasional sorrow. These were the spaces where the ordinary intersected with the extraordinary. Residents described the city as alive, attentive to their smallest gestures, and sensitive to the undercurrents of rumor and superstition. The church itself, perched modestly on a side street, became a focal point in a city increasingly aware of its presence. Its spire cast long shadows in the morning sun, and its interior, lit by flickering candles, seemed to amplify every whisper, every hesitant confession, every nervous glance from the pews. Here, the ordinary rhythms of Berlin life collided with the subtle, creeping influence of Father Albrecht, setting the stage for a psychological tension that would ripple through the entire community. The cultural and intellectual milieu of Berlin also played a role in shaping the response to the priest. Cafes, salons, and lecture halls were filled with debates on science, philosophy, and theology, and yet even the most educated minds could not dismiss the rumors entirely. There was an understanding, unspoken yet pervasive, that Berlin was a city of enigmas, a place where human behavior could be observed, measured, and yet never fully predicted. This duality allowed Father Albrecht's claims to gain traction. They were simultaneously impossible and plausible, heretical and fascinating. Scholars and clergy argued in hushed tones over candlelight about whether the priest's methods were the product of genuine insight, delusion, or cunning manipulation. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, seamstresses, laborers, and children, experienced the unfolding mystery in an entirely visceral way. Fear was no longer abstract, it was tangible, infiltrating dreams, conversations, and even the rhythm of their daily routines. Neighborhood life became subtly altered as the rumors spread. Streets that were once ordinary became charged with unspoken anxiety, and ordinary acts were tinged with suspicion. Parents whispered warnings to children about wandering too far, shopkeepers watched patrons with a newfound wariness, and neighbors began to notice each other in ways that were unnervingly precise. Every sound, every shadow, every unexpected glance could be interpreted as a message, a sign that Father Albrecht, or the invisible force he claimed to wield, was observing, counting, cataloging. Even those who professed skepticism could not entirely shake the unease, for the city itself seemed complicit in his growing legend. Berlin became a silent witness, its architecture and streets participating in the spread of fear as much as its people. The fog that drifted between spires and rooftops became a symbol of the uncertainty that enveloped the city, a visual representation of the intangible tension simmering below the surface of everyday life. The economy and social networks of the city added another layer to the unfolding story. Markets were filled with the chatter of vendors, and the patterns of trade reflected the rhythms of human activity in a microcosm of the city's broader structure. The presence of the priest seemed to subtly shift these patterns. Conversations paused, transactions became more measured, and rumors of counted souls interwove with the mundane exchanges of bread, coal, and cloth. People began to notice connections where none may have existed, projecting the priest's influence into every corner of their daily routines. The ordinary became infused with the extraordinary, and Berliners began to measure not just goods, but human behavior, in the shadow of the priest's mysterious reputation. Even the arts and literature of the time seemed to absorb the tension. Writers and painters who frequented the city's cafes spoke in coded language about unseen forces and hidden eyes, while musicians composed pieces that echoed the uncertainty and subtle dread felt by their audiences. The cultural heartbeat of Berlin pulsed with the same rhythm as the rumor, and the city itself became a living stage on which the priest's legend could unfold. In this environment, it was not difficult for a man of unusual conviction and meticulous obsession to command attention and sow the seeds of unease. The stage was thus perfectly set. Berlin was a city in transition, teetering between progress and superstition, reason and belief, modernity and the ghosts of its past. Streets, buildings, and inhabitants were primed for the infiltration of fear, fascination, and the unknown. Father Albrecht's presence was no longer a mere curiosity, it was a phenomenon that touched every layer of the city, from the cobblestones beneath tired feet to the lofty spires that reached into the fog. The environment itself seemed to conspire in his story, amplifying whispers, magnifying anomalies, and making the improbable feel inevitable. In such a city, the counting of souls was not merely a priestly obsession, it became a tangible force shaping the rhythm of life, a tension felt in every glance, every murmur, every hesitant step down a shadowed street. Berlin was alive, and it was watching. Father Albrecht was a man who arrived in Berlin quietly, almost unnoticeably, yet it was his presence that would soon bend the perception of those around him. To the casual observer, he appeared to be an ordinary priest, solemn and devout, performing his duties with a calm precision that suggested discipline rather than obsession. He moved through the parish in measured steps, hands folded, eyes occasionally lingering on details that others might overlook, the alignment of candles, the placement of books, the worn paths in the church floorboards where countless feet had trodden over decades. At first, his parishioners admired him, impressed by his dedication and the quiet authority with which he guided services. He spoke with a measured, melodic cadence, offering solace in the confessions of the faithful, and his sermons, though traditional in content, carried a weight that made the congregation feel as if their lives were being observed in some profound, ineffable way. It was during these early days that small peculiarities began to emerge. Parishioners noticed that Father Albrecht kept meticulous records, far beyond what was customary for a parish priest. His ledger contained pages upon pages of carefully written notes, seemingly cataloguing the smallest details of daily life. The names of those attending Mass were recorded alongside observations about their demeanor, the timing of their confessions, and the cadence of their prayers. At first, these entries seemed innocuous, a reflection of a man devoted to his duties, yet the precision suggested a deeper obsession. Those who glimpsed the ledger remarked on the almost mechanical consistency of its entries, as if each life were a variable in an equation only he could comprehend. This subtle abnormality planted seeds of unease, not immediately fear, but the kind of curiosity that slowly grows into apprehension. Father Albrecht's reputation began to spread beyond the walls of the church through word of mouth, each retelling adding slight embellishments, half-understood observations, or glimpses into the priest's unusual habits. Children whispered about the way he would sometimes stand motionless in the shadows of the churchyard, counting the petals of flowers or the steps of passers-by. Adults reported strange coincidences, such as noticing that his ledger would contain details of private events that no ordinary person could have witnessed. These accounts, though anecdotal, gained credibility because they originated from multiple sources across different neighborhoods. The stories created a subtle but pervasive tension, a sense that something extraordinary was unfolding beneath the veneer of ordinary life. The psychological profile of Father Albrecht became clearer to those who observed him closely. He was disciplined, meticulous, and profoundly focused, yet there were moments when the intensity of his attention seemed unnatural. He would often pause mid-task, his eyes tracing invisible patterns in the air, muttering numbers under his breath, as if tallying things unseen by ordinary senses. Parishioners reported hearing him speak of souls, in a tone that suggested both reverence and calculation, the two emotions intertwined in ways that were deeply unsettling. Children, in particular, were sensitive to his presence. Some claimed that when they approached him, they could feel a weight pressing on their chests, a sensation they could not explain but that made them wary of speaking freely in his presence. These experiences, though subtle, contributed to the growing aura of unease surrounding him, blending fascination with the first hints of fear. His interactions with the congregation were marked by an eerie combination of warmth and precision. He would offer comfort, yet his words often carried double meanings, prompting introspection that could feel uncomfortable or even accusatory. Parishioners began to notice that he seemed aware of their private concerns before they had spoken of them. For some, this was a miracle, a sign of divine insight; for others, it was a source of subtle dread. The ambiguity of his nature, half saint, half enigma, ensured that even those skeptical of supernatural claims could not fully dismiss the sense of being observed, measured, and catalogued. This delicate balance between trust and fear became a defining feature of life around Father Albrecht, shaping behavior, altering interactions, and leaving subtle but lasting psychological traces on those who came under his gaze. Observers outside the parish also took note. Local merchants, scholars, and civic officials reported peculiar coincidences related to his presence. A baker claimed that bread he left to rise would sometimes collapse in patterns reflecting church events, while a shoemaker described how shoes left unattended would be rearranged in his workshop in ways that mirrored the priest's meticulous counting habits. These incidents, seemingly minor on their own, accumulated into a growing narrative that Father Albrecht was no ordinary man. Each report fed into the city's broader consciousness, blending mundane observation with hints of the inexplicable, creating a slow-building tension that threaded through the neighborhoods and public spaces. Even the natural environment seemed attuned to him. The fog that rolled through the streets at dawn would sometimes swirl around the churchyard as he performed his morning routines. Rain would fall in irregular patterns, puddles reflecting the flickering gaslights and shadows of the buildings, and passers-by occasionally felt the impression of a gaze that counted their steps. Though such perceptions could be dismissed as coincidence or imagination, the repeated nature of these events lent them a weight that could not be ignored. The city itself seemed to participate in the legend, reinforcing the sense that Father Albrecht's presence extended beyond the purely human into the realm of atmospheric and psychological influence. Despite the subtle terror he inspired, there was also a magnetic pull to his presence. Parishioners often found themselves drawn back to the church, compelled by a mixture of reverence, curiosity, and a desire to understand the man who seemed to peer into the essence of their lives. People would linger after services, hoping for a word, a glance, or some sign of understanding, yet Father Albrecht maintained a deliberate distance, revealing only what he chose, leaving the rest to imagination and speculation. This combination of accessibility and elusiveness heightened the aura of mystery, ensuring that ordinary interactions became psychologically charged, each encounter layered with potential significance beyond what was immediately visible. As his reputation solidified, the line between reality and perception began to blur. Ordinary details of parish life, the arrangement of candles, the patterns of footsteps on the church floor, the cadence of prayers, were imbued with new meaning. Parishioners began to interpret small anomalies as signs of greater truths, projecting the priest's intentions onto everyday events. The psychological atmosphere of the parish shifted, creating a space where fear, reverence, and fascination intertwined, each feeding into the other, amplifying the sense that Father Albrecht existed on a plane of understanding inaccessible to ordinary people. By the end of his first year, Father Albrecht was no longer just a priest performing familiar rituals. He had become an enigma, a figure whose presence reshaped the parish and surrounding neighborhoods in subtle, persistent ways. People spoke of him in hushed tones, half in awe, half in fear, and the city itself seemed to accommodate his legend, amplifying the tension that had begun with his arrival. The ordinary routines of life had been quietly transformed, leaving an impression that would linger, unseen but deeply felt, long after his first steps on the cobblestones. The first murmurs of unease began as subtle observations, small, almost imperceptible anomalies that slowly rippled through the parish. Parishioners noticed that Father Albrecht's eyes lingered on certain individuals longer than seemed necessary, that his gaze could follow a person across the nave with uncanny precision. Some remarked that he seemed to know when someone entered the church even before they arrived, appearing at the lectern or confessional in perfect synchrony with the flow of human traffic. At first, these details were attributed to sharp observation and intuition, qualities admired in any spiritual leader. Yet as the weeks passed, the congregation began to sense a pattern, a consistency in his attentions that suggested something beyond natural perception. It was in these quiet, unremarkable moments that the first seeds of fear took root, for they implied that Father Albrecht's awareness extended beyond what any ordinary human could accomplish. Children were often the first to perceive things adults dismissed. They whispered to one another about the way he would sometimes speak in hushed tones, counting softly under his breath. 1, 2, 3, they reported hearing, though when questioned, they could not say what he was counting. Some described feeling a strange pressure in their chests when he passed by, a weight they could not explain, an almost physical sense that he was aware of. More than just the surface of their lives. Adults were quick to rationalize these accounts, attributing them to imagination, fear of authority, or childish superstition. Yet the accumulation of these small observations created a pattern too persistent to ignore, and even skeptical neighbors began to notice coincidences that defied simple explanation. Eyewitnesses began to recount encounters that added layers to the growing mystery. One parishioner, a baker who had been part of the community for decades, claimed that the priest's ledger contained precise notes about the comings and goings of people he could not possibly have observed directly. Another witness, a seamstress, recalled the meticulous rearrangement of objects in her shop after Father Albrecht had visited. Coins would be realigned into exact sequences, fabrics folded in ways that mirrored no ordinary pattern. These incidents, while not overtly threatening, carried an emotional weight that unsettled the observers. The impression grew that Father Albrecht was not merely attentive to his surroundings but was engaged in a deliberate, systematic cataloging of human behavior, accounting that extended beyond the material into something more abstract and profound. Word of these strange occurrences began to spread through the parish and into the wider neighborhoods. Conversations that had once centered on mundane affairs now included cautious references to the priest's unusual behavior. Some whispered in fear, others with fascination, but all contributed to the slow amplification of his reputation. Unlike rumors that fade quickly, these stories persisted and multiplied, embedding themselves into the daily consciousness of Berliners. People began to alter their behavior, sometimes unconsciously, as they became aware of the priest's observant presence. Steps were measured more carefully, glances were avoided, prayers were offered with added care, all under the shadow of an invisible, methodical scrutiny. Even church officials began to take note. Senior clergy observed that parishioners were becoming divided in subtle ways, their faith intertwined with an anxiety they could neither fully explain nor control. Meetings were held in quiet offices behind closed doors, discussions that weighed the unusual behavior of Father Albrecht against his outward devotion and the positive influence he seemed to maintain on the congregation. Some argued that his methods were extraordinary but ultimately harmless, while others suspected an unhealthy obsession that could lead to spiritual and psychological disruption. These debates, though conducted in private, contributed indirectly to the legend, as any official acknowledgement lent credibility to the notion that something significant, if not alarming, was unfolding. The intensity of Father Albrecht's focus grew as well. Observers noted that he would sometimes linger after services, meticulously noting names, events, and minor interactions in his ledger. Candles would be counted repeatedly, their positions adjusted with geometric precision, and no detail seemed too small to escape his attention. The combination of routine spiritual guidance with such meticulous record-keeping created an atmosphere in which ordinary worship became intertwined with ritualistic observation. Parishioners described a subtle shift in the tone of services, where moments of prayer carried an underlying tension, a sense that they were being watched in ways that transcended physical presence. Rumors began to intertwine with folklore, blending everyday experience with narrative embellishment. Tales spread of small, uncanny coincidences that seemed almost fated. Windows left open during a storm were said to echo the patterns of his counting. Animals behaved strangely in his presence, dogs whining in corners, cats avoiding certain pews. People began to project intention onto these incidents, interpreting them as evidence of a hidden, deliberate order in the priest's activities. The boundary between observation and imagination became increasingly porous, allowing fear and fascination to grow in tandem. Visitors to the church also contributed to the widening circle of influence. Travelers from other neighborhoods and distant towns reported the peculiar precision of Father Albrecht's rituals, from the exact timing of his sermons to the deliberate movements he executed during confession. These accounts, carried back to other communities, lent an air of wider significance to the phenomena, suggesting that the priest's influence extended beyond his immediate parish. The impression took hold that Father Albrecht was engaged in an extraordinary enterprise, one that combined spiritual authority with a systematic, almost scientific, attention to human life. The effect on the parish community was profound. Social dynamics shifted in subtle but perceptible ways. People who had once interacted freely now moved cautiously, weighing each word, each gesture, against the possibility that they were being mentally recorded in some meticulous ledger. Even casual greetings became tentative, laden with unspoken concern. Psychological tension spread, manifesting as sleepless nights, vague anxiety, and heightened attention to small details. It was as if the ordinary rhythms of life had been rewired, with the priest serving as an unseen conductor orchestrating the ebb and flow of fear and fascination. By the end of this period, Father Albrecht's presence had transitioned from being merely unusual to profoundly unsettling. The first witnesses had shifted from passive observers to active participants in the unfolding drama, caught between awe, fear, and a desire to understand the mysterious methods of the priest. The church, once a sanctuary, had become a locus of psychological intensity, where ordinary life was intertwined with extraordinary scrutiny, and every minor detail seemed to carry weight beyond comprehension. The slow, meticulous escalation of his influence laid the groundwork for a city gripped by whispers, suspicion, and the chilling notion that human lives might be counted, measured, and catalogued in ways that transcended ordinary understanding. As the weeks passed, the initial whispers of curiosity and subtle unease began to harden into resistance and skepticism. Not everyone in the parish welcomed Father Albrecht's peculiar attentions, and the wider religious community took notice of his growing reputation. The senior clergy, accustomed to maintaining order and doctrine within their parishes, began to scrutinize his methods with increasing concern. Letters were exchanged between church officials, reports filed of unusual practices, and informal investigations conducted to determine whether this priest's meticulous counting of souls was an innocent eccentricity or the beginnings of heretical influence. The tension between adherence to tradition and the unfolding strangeness of Father Albrecht's behavior created an atmosphere thick with both anxiety and intrigue, as observers struggled to discern whether his actions were the product of divine insight, obsessive compulsion, or something far darker. Public denials and attempts at suppression emerged quickly. Some neighboring priests sought to reassure their congregations that there was no cause for fear, dismissing the growing rumors as the exaggerations of imaginative parishioners. Sermons reminded the faithful to trust in doctrine and not in the peculiar whims of a single man, urging calm, reason, and steadfast devotion. Yet such reassurances were fragile, for the ordinary people of Berlin were perceptive, and subtle inconsistencies in Father Albrecht's practices could not be ignored. Despite the official stance of denial, many continued to observe his behavior with cautious fascination, interpreting every gesture, every ledger entry, every murmured word as confirmation of the extraordinary claims that had begun to circulate. Within the parish itself, the division between believers and skeptics became increasingly pronounced. Some followers regarded Father Albrecht with a near-reverent awe, convinced that his counting of souls was a reflection of divine authority, a glimpse into a higher order of existence that ordinary humans could scarcely comprehend. Others recoiled in unease, perceiving the precision and obsession as unnatural, intrusive, and morally suspect. Families were torn by these conflicting perceptions, discussions at dinner tables became strained, and whispered conversations in shops and alleyways spoke of fear, doubt, and speculation. Even casual observers could sense the tension, as the parish transformed into a psychological battleground where faith, fear, and fascination collided. Resistance took both subtle and overt forms. Some parishioners avoided church services altogether, claiming mundane excuses while their absence served as quiet protest. Others approached Father Albrecht with pointed questions about his methods, seeking reassurance or challenge. These interactions, however, rarely produced clarity. The priest answered with calm, measured words, speaking of souls in ways that were simultaneously comforting and disquieting. To some, he offered profound insight, to others, he sowed further confusion. The duality of his presence, both authoritative and enigmatic, heightened the psychological tension, creating an environment in which ordinary religious practice became interwoven with fear, obsession, and subtle manipulation. The broader city responded in a similar way, oscillating between skepticism and fascination. Scholars, intellectuals, and civic officials debated the nature of the phenomenon, weighing theological, psychological, and scientific explanations. Some argued that mass hysteria was at work, that the cumulative effect of rumor, suggestion, and heightened awareness could account for the seemingly impossible observations. Others posited more spiritual or mystical interpretations, suggesting that Father Albrecht was an instrument of divine will, capable of perceiving what ordinary humans could not. These competing explanations further intensified the uncertainty, leaving ordinary citizens caught between rational skepticism and the unsettling possibility that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. The psychological impact on individuals became increasingly pronounced. Parishioners reported sleepless nights, troubled dreams, and an ongoing sensation of being observed or measured in ways that they could not define. Children, particularly sensitive to shifts in attention and mood, described feeling a weight pressing upon them, an invisible presence that seemed to track their movements and count their actions. Adults experienced a similar sense of unease, often finding themselves repeating mundane tasks with meticulous care, as though aware that their behavior was being silently evaluated. The ordinary patterns of daily life were reshaped, transformed by the subtle yet persistent influence of the priest's attention, the ledger of observation becoming a psychological instrument of slow, insidious control. Even ordinary routines began to carry an added weight. Markets, cafes, and tram cars felt different under the shadow of Father Albrecht's reputation. People paused their conversations, measured their gestures, and observed one another with heightened awareness, as if some unseen authority were cataloguing each interaction. Rumors and anecdotal evidence, once trivial, became significant, as ordinary Berliners sought to interpret subtle signs and coincidences in light of the priest's alleged abilities. The city, once vibrant with mundane activity, seemed to adopt a slower, more deliberate rhythm, each person influenced by the sense of observation, measurement, and the uncanny suggestion that nothing escaped notice. Religious authorities attempted formal measures to curb the spread of fear. Notices were posted reminding parishioners to trust in scripture and reason, while discreet inquiries into Father Albrecht's conduct were conducted behind closed doors. Yet these interventions often had the opposite effect, lending an air of legitimacy to the notion that something unusual was occurring. Ordinary people interpreted the official attention as proof that the priest's activities were noteworthy, his presence significant beyond mere eccentricity. In this way, the very attempts to suppress his reputation contributed to its amplification, creating a feedback loop in which curiosity and fear intertwined and strengthened one another. Stories of peculiar coincidences multiplied, blurring the lines between everyday experience and extraordinary perception. Small details, once unnoticed, were imbued with meaning. Candles fell in unusual sequences, ledger entries seemed to predict future events, and minor accidents took on symbolic significance in the collective imagination. Parishioners began to interpret these occurrences as evidence of a deeper order, a hidden system of observation and calculation operated by Father Albrecht. The ordinary church, once a sanctuary, became a space charged with tension, where every movement and interaction could be scrutinized and assigned significance. By the close of this period, the parish was divided and tense, a microcosm of the broader city's oscillation between skepticism, fear, and fascination. Father Albrecht's presence had transcended ordinary eccentricity, establishing him as a figure both compelling and unsettling. The first acts of resistance, combined with whispered rumors, official attempts at denial, and a subtle shift in psychological atmosphere, set the stage for the subsequent escalation. The tension between those who followed with reverent awe and those who recoiled in fear created a fertile environment for deeper mysteries to emerge. The parish, and by extension the city, had entered a new phase in which the ordinary rhythms of life were entangled with the extraordinary, and where subtle attention, meticulous counting, and psychological manipulation would shape the unfolding drama in ways that would reverberate far beyond the church walls. The intensity of Father Albrecht's rituals grew with time, and with each passing day, the parishioners felt the weight of his presence more profoundly. His attention to detail became almost ritualistic in nature, transforming ordinary tasks into acts of subtle obsession. Candles were not merely lit, they were counted, adjusted, and relit according to a precise pattern only he seemed to understand. The pews, the altar, the floorboards, everything was observed, measured, and catalogued with unwavering focus. Parishioners noticed that even the smallest deviations from his invisible order were corrected almost imperceptibly, a flick of a hand, a shift in placement, a quiet muttered word. These adjustments, though seemingly trivial, reinforced the sense that nothing escaped his scrutiny and that every action, no matter how mundane, was part of a larger tally. The psychological impact on the congregation was palpable. People began to feel as though they were constantly under observation, their every movement subtly measured and recorded. Children, in particular, exhibited heightened anxiety, often hesitating at thresholds, slowing their steps, or refraining from speaking freely when the priest was present. Adults experienced similar effects, their routines becoming more deliberate, their gestures more precise, as though the very act of living was subject to evaluation. The ordinary rhythms of life were subtly altered, and small acts, walking down a street, entering a shop, speaking to a neighbor, carried an unspoken weight. Even the air seemed charged with expectation, a quiet tension that persisted long after Father Albrecht had left the room, leaving a lingering sense of meticulous attention and silent judgment. As these effects grew, rumors and stories multiplied. Parishioners spoke of seeing the priest counting silently during Mass, not with coins or books, but with the very presence of the congregation. His ledger, always present and meticulously maintained, seemed to catalogue more than attendance, hinting at invisible metrics that could not be quantified by ordinary means. Some claimed to notice that certain individuals were mentioned repeatedly, their names marked with particular care, suggesting that Father Albrecht had singled them out for reasons no one could articulate. These reports spread beyond the parish walls, carried by visitors and travelers, and slowly shaped a perception that Father Albrecht's focus extended beyond human comprehension, that he was engaged in a process that intertwined observation, ritual, and perhaps even fate itself. The priest's obsession also manifested in the timing and structure of his daily activities. He moved with a deliberate rhythm, performing each ritual with mathematical precision, never rushed, never inattentive. Parishioners noticed the extraordinary regularity of his walks through the church, the exacting cadence of his prayers, and the careful measurement of his gestures. Even seemingly spontaneous acts, such as greeting a visitor or offering counsel, bore the mark of meticulous planning. This consistency was both mesmerizing and unsettling. To those who observed closely, the impression was not of a man merely following routine, but of a person orchestrating the subtle movements of a living, breathing system, of which they themselves were an integral part. Some of the most unsettling accounts came from individuals who had previously been skeptical. A local merchant, who had once dismissed the priest's counting as harmless eccentricity, reported feeling an intense, almost physical sensation of being measured during a visit to the church. He described a pressure, subtle but undeniable, pressing against his chest, accompanied by a mental awareness that his actions were being silently tallied. Others reported similar experiences, a shiver when a name was spoken, a sudden awareness of footsteps not their own, or the inexplicable feeling of being catalogued in a ledger that existed beyond ordinary perception. These phenomena, while intangible and impossible to measure, created a pervasive sense of dread and fascination that touched all who came into Father Albrecht's orbit. The community began to notice patterns in behavior and coincidence that they could not easily explain. Ordinary events seemed imbued with meaning, as if some invisible hand was orchestrating interactions according to a precise, unknowable logic. Lost items were found in exact alignment with prior rituals, casual conversations echoed phrases or numbers that appeared in the priest's ledger, and small accidents seemed to correspond with particular days or individuals. The effect was cumulative, building a sense of inevitability and foreboding that intertwined with everyday life. People became cautious, their perceptions sharpened, their attention drawn to details they had previously ignored. Even those who tried to maintain skepticism found themselves participating in an unspoken game of observation and subtle calculation. Father Albrecht's methods blurred the line between devotion and compulsion. To the untrained eye, his rituals resembled ordinary clerical duties; to the perceptive observer, they suggested a deeper, almost obsessive engagement with human life and behavior. He spoke of souls in tones both reverent and analytical, as if measuring, counting, and observing were part of a spiritual responsibility. Parishioners were drawn into his rhythms, willingly or not, their own behaviors subtly shaped by the knowledge that they were being catalogued. Over time, the church ceased to be merely a place of worship and became a stage on which the intricate interplay of observation, fear, and fascination unfolded. The effect on the community's mental state was profound. Anxiety became pervasive, subtle but persistent, manifesting in restlessness, sleeplessness, and heightened awareness of every small detail. Families observed each other more carefully, children mirrored the meticulous attention they witnessed in the priest, and neighbors began to interpret ordinary coincidences as evidence of some hidden order. Conversations were tempered, gestures measured, and even casual interactions were imbued with significance. It was as if the entire parish had been drawn into a psychological pattern set by Father Albrecht, each person playing a part in a carefully orchestrated system whose rules were invisible but deeply felt. By the end of this period, the parish had entered a state of heightened tension. Ordinary life continued, but under the constant, invisible influence of the priest's meticulous attention. The subtle, almost imperceptible changes in behavior, perception, and social interaction created an atmosphere of quiet dread and fascination. The community had become entwined in his rituals, their daily lives shaped by the sense of observation, measurement, and counting. Father Albrecht's influence had moved beyond personal eccentricity to become a pervasive force, quietly reshaping the psychological landscape of the parish and setting the stage for the more overt and unsettling events that would soon follow. As time passed, Father Albrecht's presence began to exert a subtle but undeniable pressure on the minds of those around him. The parishioners, once merely curious or apprehensive, now experienced a psychological weight that lingered long after they left the church. Ordinary tasks, from walking down the cobblestone streets to performing daily chores, were infused with the sense that each action was observed, measured, and recorded. Even the smallest gestures, folding a handkerchief, placing a coin on the counter, or glancing at a neighbor, carried significance under the invisible gaze of the priest. The meticulousness of his habits and the seeming precision of his observations transformed everyday life into a landscape of subtle anxiety, where human behavior was both guided and constrained by an unseen, meticulous authority. Rumors began to amplify, weaving a narrative that stretched beyond the confines of the parish. Stories circulated of people behaving in ways they could not fully explain, of small coincidences and uncanny alignments that seemed to echo the priest's ledger. Children spoke of whispered numbers that followed them in dreams, adults recounted fleeting impressions of being counted in moments they could not define. Even the most skeptical found themselves questioning their perception, aware that their thoughts and actions might somehow intersect with an unseen pattern. The ordinary world became a stage on which subtle manipulations, deliberate or inadvertent, unfolded, and every interaction carried the faint but insistent impression of significance beyond comprehension. Social life within the parish shifted as well. Families and neighbors began to mirror the meticulous attention they observed in Father Albrecht, often unconsciously. Conversations were tempered, movements measured, and glances calculated with newfound care. Shops and public spaces carried an undercurrent of tension, as if each person were participating in a collective choreography of observation and awareness. Ordinary events, passing a street corner, exchanging a greeting, or performing routine chores, were filtered through the lens of potential scrutiny. What had begun as quiet fascination became a pervasive, almost inescapable psychological influence, extending beyond the walls of the church into the rhythms of daily life. The psychological tension created fertile ground for superstition to flourish. Ordinary coincidences were interpreted as deliberate acts of influence, while mundane patterns assumed hidden meaning. A dropped candle became a portent, a misplaced book a subtle message, a child's sneeze a signal in a system of observation that defied ordinary understanding. In this environment, rational explanations struggled to gain traction. Even the most logical observers found themselves drawn into the narrative, their perceptions colored by the persistent sense of being watched and measured. Berlin itself, with its fog-laden streets and narrow alleys, seemed to amplify the tension, as if the city had absorbed the presence of the priest and mirrored the growing unease of its inhabitants. Some individuals sought explanations in faith, interpreting Father Albrecht's counting as an expression of divine insight. They believed he was gifted with a rare ability to perceive the spiritual order of the world, that his ledger reflected a sacred record of human life. Others attempted rational or scientific interpretations, speculating that the priest's meticulous habits were a form of psychological influence, a methodical manipulation that shaped perception and behavior without overt coercion. Yet these explanations offered only partial relief, for the combination of observed patterns, coincidental events, and personal experiences created a tension that neither belief nor reason could entirely dissipate. The parish, once a place of ordinary worship and spiritual comfort, became a theater of observation, anxiety, and subtle control. Individuals found themselves participating in routines and behaviors shaped by the unspoken presence of the priest, their actions guided by both reverence and fear. Children were particularly affected, their behaviors more cautious, their movements measured, and their attention attuned to subtle cues from adults and peers alike. Adults, too, found themselves adjusting daily routines, interpreting ordinary coincidences as evidence of observation, and projecting intention onto events that might otherwise have been dismissed. The interplay of perception, superstition, and ritual created a dense psychological environment, one in which the ordinary rhythms of life were deeply entangled with the extraordinary. Local authorities and church officials continued to observe the unfolding situation with concern. Reports were filed, meetings held, and inquiries made into the priest's behavior. Yet interventions often had unintended consequences. Even the act of questioning or monitoring the priest lent legitimacy to the sense that something unusual, and perhaps significant, was occurring. Ordinary citizens, observing the subtle tensions among officials and clergy, interpreted the scrutiny as confirmation that Father Albrecht's abilities or influence were not to be dismissed lightly. Thus, the interplay of observation, rumor, and authority amplified the psychological impact, creating an environment in which fear and fascination coexisted, each reinforcing the other. The culmination of these influences began to manifest in more overt ways. Individuals reported heightened senses of awareness, seeing patterns and alignments that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. They interpreted shadows, movements, and sounds as carrying deliberate meaning, sensing that each occurrence could be part of a broader system of observation. The ordinary world, filtered through the lens of fear and fascination, became a network of interlocking signs and subtle interactions, a reality in which the unseen presence of Father Albrecht shaped perception and behavior at every level. Even casual interactions, once devoid of deeper significance, were now infused with tension, as though each participant were conscious of an invisible ledger in which their actions were catalogued. By the end of this period, the parish had been irrevocably transformed. Ordinary life continued, yet beneath the surface ran a subtle but powerful current of psychological tension. The influence of Father Albrecht extended beyond his direct interactions, shaping the behavior, perception, and emotional state of the entire community. Rumors, anecdotes, and coincidences combined with observation and superstition to create a pervasive sense of unease, one that touched all who came into contact with the church or its parishioners. The ordinary rhythms of life were now infused with meaning, subtle anxiety, and the ever-present notion that human actions, no matter how small, were being counted, catalogued, and scrutinized in ways beyond ordinary comprehension. The subtle tension that had been building in the parish slowly escalated, reaching a point where it began to affect the broader community. Ordinary life continued, but it was increasingly under the shadow of Father Albrecht's meticulous observation. Streets and shops seemed charged with the presence of his unseen attention, and even those who had never set foot inside the church reported a sense of unease, as if the city itself had absorbed the influence of his counting. People began to notice coincidences that they could not easily explain, a dropped coin appearing in a precise sequence, the alignment of chairs in a cafe reflecting some invisible pattern, the recurrence of particular numbers in mundane daily events. These minor anomalies, taken individually, might have seemed trivial, but collectively they contributed to a growing sense of a pervasive, almost mystical order imposed upon the ordinary. Some parishioners reported experiencing a creeping isolation, as if their awareness of the priest's presence had changed the way they perceived their own social connections. Conversations became more cautious, glances more measured, and every gesture seemed to carry unintended significance. People began to question their own memories and perceptions, wondering if events had occurred as they remembered or if they had been subtly influenced by the silent authority that Father Albrecht seemed to wield. Children, highly sensitive to the atmosphere, became hesitant in play and withdrawn in social interactions, often retreating to the corners of rooms or seeking reassurance from parents before engaging in ordinary activities. The psychological weight of observation had begun to restructure behavior at both the individual and community levels, creating a pervasive sense of tension that seemed to seep into every corner of daily life. Neighborhood gossip, once light-hearted and mundane, became suffused with layers of fear and speculation. People recounted stories of being silently counted, of items mysteriously aligned, or of unusual coincidences that defied ordinary logic. Some claimed to hear the priest muttering numbers under his breath while performing mundane tasks, while others described strange patterns emerging in their own lives that they could not reconcile. Even those who sought rational explanations often found themselves drawn into the narrative, unable to dismiss the mounting evidence of subtle influence. The ordinary social fabric of the community was now interwoven with the legend of the priest, and daily routines were filtered through the lens of both anxiety and fascination. Attempts at understanding or explanation became increasingly fraught. Local scholars and clergy debated whether the observed phenomena could be attributed to heightened perception, coincidence, or some unexplained spiritual force. Psychologists and early researchers in human behavior, when consulted, noted the extraordinary precision of Father Albrecht's habits, but were unable to offer conclusive interpretations. The uncertainty only heightened the sense of mystery, creating fertile ground for folklore and rumor to flourish. Ordinary citizens, caught between skepticism and belief, began to invest in a narrative that made sense of the unexplained, that Father Albrecht's counting of souls was not merely symbolic, but a tangible, active process that shaped the rhythm of life around him. Isolation became an increasingly common experience for those deeply affected by the priest's methods. Individuals who had once been active in social and community life withdrew into their homes, avoiding gatherings or extended interactions with neighbors. The perception that their behavior was under constant, silent scrutiny led to subtle paranoia, a heightened awareness of every word spoken and every gesture made. Even casual greetings and small talk were performed with careful consideration, as people attempted to navigate the invisible ledger that seemed to catalogue their existence. The church, once a place of solace and fellowship, had become a locus of quiet control, its influence extending far beyond its physical walls into the mental and emotional lives of all who came into contact with it. Reports of inexplicable coincidences multiplied. Objects moved in precise sequences, footsteps aligned in unusual patterns, and minor accidents appeared to follow rules that no one could fully understand. Some parishioners began to interpret these events as intentional messages, believing that the priest's counting extended into dimensions beyond their ordinary perception. Ordinary daily events were no longer simply routine, they were imbued with meaning, interpreted as part of a system that measured not only actions but intentions, emotions, and perhaps even fate itself. The effect was cumulative, layering anxiety and fascination in ways that slowly reshaped perception, leaving individuals uncertain of what was natural and what was guided by the priest's unseen hand. Community dynamics became increasingly strained. Families whispered in corners, neighbors eyed one another with subtle suspicion, and social gatherings were marked by heightened awareness and careful observation. People adjusted their behaviors to align with perceived expectations, anticipating the scrutiny of Father Albrecht even when he was not present. The ordinary boundaries between public and private life blurred, and the parish's influence extended into every social interaction. It was as if an invisible ledger catalogued the rhythms of daily life, assigning significance to the smallest actions and altering the course of human behavior without the need for overt intervention. By the end of this period, the parish and its surrounding neighborhoods were enmeshed in a complex web of observation, ritual, and subtle psychological control. Ordinary life had not stopped, but it had been reshaped, infused with a pervasive awareness of unseen authority. People moved carefully, spoke cautiously, and interpreted ordinary events with heightened attention, their perception of reality layered with suspicion, fear, and fascination. The psychological impact of Father Albrecht's counting had transformed the community, creating a state in which the ordinary rhythms of life were deeply entwined with the extraordinary, and where each moment carried the silent weight of meticulous observation. The subtle yet pervasive influence of Father Albrecht began to manifest in ways that were more overt, leaving an impression not only on individual parishioners but on the broader community of Berlin. Ordinary routines, once comfortable and predictable, now carried an underlying tension, as people became acutely aware that their actions, words, and even thoughts might somehow be catalogued in the priest's meticulous ledger. Shops and markets were observed with quiet suspicion, and seemingly trivial interactions, exchanging a coin, nodding to a neighbor, offering a handshake, were infused with significance. Those who had once dismissed the priest's habits as eccentricity began to sense that his influence extended beyond mere observation, shaping perception and behavior in ways that were invisible yet undeniably real. Witnesses described a creeping sense of isolation that affected not only individuals but entire families. Children, sensitive to the subtleties of human attention, began to withdraw, often retreating to the corners of rooms or remaining silent during conversations where they might once have spoken freely. Adults, too, adjusted their behavior, carefully moderating speech and movement as if conscious that each act was being silently measured and recorded. Ordinary gestures, pouring a cup of tea, arranging furniture, walking down the street, became layered with unspoken significance, and people found themselves performing with a heightened awareness that blurred the line between natural behavior and compelled action. Even casual interactions were transformed, each imbued with the subtle weight of scrutiny and unspoken expectation. Reports of uncanny coincidences multiplied, further intensifying the sense of unease. Items were found rearranged in precise order, footsteps aligned in repeated patterns, and conversations echoed phrases or numbers that appeared in Father Albrecht's ledger. The accumulation of these small, enigmatic events created a psychological atmosphere in which ordinary life felt subtly orchestrated, as though some invisible hand guided the rhythms of daily existence. Parishioners interpreted these occurrences as deliberate, attributing intention to events that might otherwise have been dismissed as coincidence. The ordinary world had been reframed, shaped by the silent ledger that seemed to catalogue every interaction, every decision, and perhaps even the emotional state of those within its reach. The growing complexity of the priest's influence fostered an environment in which superstition flourished. Ordinary events became symbols, minor anomalies assumed meaning, and every irregularity was imbued with a sense of purpose. Parishioners began to anticipate sequences and patterns, reading significance into everyday life, and perceiving connections that were invisible to those outside the parish. Even the city itself, with its fog-laden streets and narrow alleyways, seemed to participate in this transformation, amplifying the subtle tension and reinforcing the perception that Father Albrecht's counting extended beyond the human into the atmospheric, the psychological, and the symbolic. Families and neighbors became both observers and participants in this quiet, collective experiment. Conversations were tempered with caution, gestures calculated, and ordinary routines reshaped by the awareness of unseen observation. Children mirrored the meticulous attention they observed in adults, learning to navigate interactions with a careful precision that had once been unnecessary. Adults, too, adjusted daily behavior to conform to subtle expectations, anticipating scrutiny even when the priest was absent. The ordinary boundaries between public and private life blurred, creating a community in which social behavior, family interaction, and personal habits were subtly guided by the unspoken rules of an invisible ledger. Even those who attempted rational explanations struggled to reconcile their experiences. Local scholars debated whether heightened perception, coincidence, or some early form of psychological influence could account for the phenomena, while clergy wrestled with theological interpretations that balanced divine insight with human eccentricity. Some theorized that Father Albrecht was uniquely gifted, capable of perceiving spiritual or moral order in ways that transcended ordinary understanding. Others suggested that his meticulous habits exerted a subtle, almost imperceptible psychological control, shaping behavior and perception without overt coercion. Yet no theory fully resolved the tension between observation, coincidence, and the sense of profound purpose that had begun to permeate daily life. The psychological strain on individuals intensified as the parish's influence reached into multiple layers of society. Ordinary events, such as visiting a shop, attending a market, or meeting a neighbor, were interpreted in light of the priest's unseen ledger. People reported an internalized sense of being watched, counted, and evaluated, a sensation that extended beyond physical presence into the very perception of time and space. Children exhibited heightened anxiety, adults experienced subtle paranoia, and the ordinary rhythms of community life were gradually reshaped under the quiet, omnipresent authority of the priest. Social cohesion was strained, as individuals became increasingly self-conscious, unsure which acts were natural and which were measured against some invisible standard. The accumulation of these subtle influences had a cumulative effect. Ordinary coincidences were no longer merely amusing, they were considered signs of pattern and purpose. Minor accidents, unusual alignments, or repeated sequences were imbued with meaning and interpreted as evidence of the priest's active observation. Every interaction, every event, every gesture carried the possibility of significance, leaving parishioners suspended between awe, fear, and a desperate desire for understanding. Ordinary life had become a theater of perception and subtle control, where the invisible ledger dictated a rhythm that intertwined with human consciousness and reshaped the landscape of daily experience. By the end of this period, Father Albrecht's presence had transformed the parish into a space of quiet psychological tension and pervasive mystery. Ordinary routines were now infused with unease, coincidence was interpreted as intention, and social interactions were conducted with a careful precision born of subtle observation. The boundaries between rational understanding and superstition had blurred, creating a community suspended between the natural and the extraordinary. The ordinary rhythms of life were irrevocably altered, shaped by the meticulous attention of a priest who counted not only souls but the patterns, alignments, and hidden metrics of human behavior, leaving an indelible imprint on the consciousness of Berlin and its people. The culmination of Father Albrecht's meticulous counting and quiet influence began to manifest in ways that were undeniable, both to the parishioners and to those in surrounding neighborhoods. Ordinary routines had become a web of observation, where even the simplest actions seemed to carry weight beyond their appearance. Children walked more carefully, whispering numbers under their breath as if mimicking the priest's hidden rituals. Adults adjusted gestures, softened voices, and measured glances, all as though their behavior was being silently logged in some invisible ledger. This pervasive awareness reshaped social dynamics, creating a collective psychological tension that spread from household to household, touching the very core of daily life. The city itself, with its winding streets and echoing stone buildings, seemed to participate in the quiet orchestration of his influence, reinforcing the perception that every action was observed, recorded, and accounted for. Parishioners began to see patterns in coincidences that would have otherwise been dismissed. Coins that fell to the floor appeared to land in sequences, shadows of passing pedestrians seemed to mirror the priest's movements, and ordinary conversations occasionally repeated phrases that coincided with entries in the priest's ledger. These incidents, accumulating over weeks and months, contributed to an atmosphere in which the ordinary laws of cause and effect seemed suspended, replaced by a more subtle and precise system that only Father Albrecht understood. What was once casual observation now appeared to be part of a deliberate, almost mechanical, process, shaping perception, attention, and even the emotional state of the community. Visitors to the parish contributed to the spreading intrigue, sharing their own experiences with the wider public. Travelers reported noticing patterns in the priest's movements, hearing him muttering numbers softly under his breath, and observing subtle alignments of objects that seemed to defy ordinary logic. Their stories carried weight, because they were independent witnesses whose accounts matched those of parishioners. As these narratives circulated, the sense of an extraordinary system of observation extended beyond the physical parish, entering the wider consciousness of Berlin. The ordinary world had become intertwined with an invisible order, one in which human actions, coincidences, and small events were suffused with new, unsettling significance. The psychological effect on parishioners intensified as the priest's methods became increasingly precise. Children displayed heightened caution, their curiosity tempered by an internalized awareness of observation. Adults developed a heightened sense of vigilance, constantly checking gestures, speech, and movement, aware that even minor deviations might attract notice or be recorded. Ordinary routines, grocery shopping, tending to a garden, walking down the street, were now conducted under a persistent, invisible scrutiny. This slow psychological pressure had transformed ordinary life into a theater of behavior, where every action was measured against an unseen standard, and ordinary interactions were layered with meaning that could not be fully comprehended. Some parishioners sought explanation in faith, attempting to reconcile the priest's behavior with spiritual doctrine. They posited that Father Albrecht had been chosen for a rare gift, an insight into the divine order that allowed him to perceive patterns and account for souls in ways invisible to ordinary humans. For these believers, the meticulous counting was not a source of fear but a reminder of the unfathomable scope of divine will. Others, however, interpreted the events as evidence of obsession or even madness, a methodical compulsion that imposed subtle psychological control over the community. The tension between belief and skepticism created fractures in social cohesion, with neighbors divided over whether to regard the priest as a vessel of divine authority, a manipulative figure, or a combination of both. Local authorities and clergy began to notice the increasing strain on the parish community. Meetings were held behind closed doors to discuss the priest's conduct, and discreet inquiries were launched to determine whether his methods were harmful or unusual. These interventions, however, often reinforced the perception that something significant was occurring. The very act of official scrutiny lent credibility to the growing mythos surrounding Father Albrecht. Ordinary citizens interpreted attention from authorities as confirmation that the priest's activities were not mere eccentricities, and that his counting of souls carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate parish. The ordinary rhythms of governance, social observation, and religious practice became intertwined with the unfolding psychological drama. As the subtle pressure built, incidents of anxiety, fear, and emotional strain became more visible. Individuals reported sleepless nights, troubled dreams, and the sensation of being watched even in private spaces. Children hesitated in their movements, adults overthought ordinary gestures, and entire households adjusted daily routines to conform to perceived expectations. Even casual interactions with neighbors were imbued with a careful calculation, as if the invisible ledger extended its reach into every relationship, assigning weight and significance to seemingly ordinary actions. Ordinary life, once predictable and comfortable, had become a landscape of psychological tension, uncertainty, and fascination. Coincidences continued to accumulate, each reinforcing the impression of a system beyond human comprehension. Small accidents, misaligned objects, and fleeting repetitions of phrases were interpreted as deliberate messages, as though Father Albrecht's counting had tangible consequences that intersected with the material world. Ordinary events now carried hidden significance, and the perception of intentional order created an atmosphere of quiet dread and reverence. People found themselves anticipating patterns, seeking to predict outcomes, and adjusting behavior to align with the perceived logic of the priest's invisible ledger. The psychological weight of participation became a shared experience, a collective engagement in a ritual whose rules were unspoken but deeply felt. By the conclusion of this period, the parish had been irrevocably transformed. The ordinary rhythms of life were entwined with a pervasive awareness of observation, measurement, and counting. Social interactions, domestic routines, and personal behavior had been subtly reshaped, reflecting a community enmeshed in a system both invisible and omnipresent. Father Albrecht's influence, though silent and understated, had become profound, leaving an indelible imprint on the consciousness of Berliners. The ordinary had merged with the extraordinary, and every aspect of daily existence now carried the quiet weight of a meticulous and enigmatic observation, an ongoing accounting of human souls that remained both mysterious and compelling. The final phase of Father Albrecht's influence unfolded with a quiet, almost imperceptible intensity, leaving a profound imprint on the parish and the wider community. By this time, the cumulative effects of observation, subtle psychological control, and ritualized counting had transformed ordinary life into a series of heightened moments, each weighted with significance. Parishioners no longer approached daily routines casually, even the smallest actions, from placing a coin on a counter to choosing which path to walk through the streets of Berlin, were performed with conscious awareness that they were being catalogued. The psychological tension, once subtle and easily dismissed, had grown into an enduring, pervasive presence, influencing thought, behavior, and social interaction across generations within the community. Visitors and travelers continued to report subtle anomalies that reinforced the reputation of Father Albrecht. Merchants noticed patterns in which objects were arranged after his visits, sequences that appeared too precise to be coincidental. Travelers remarked on the rhythmic precision of his movements, the almost musical cadence of his soft counting, and the way shadows seemed to align with his gestures. These observations spread far beyond the immediate parish, shaping a perception that extended across neighborhoods and even neighboring towns. The ordinary city, in its cobblestone streets and shadowed alleyways, had become a stage for invisible measures, a landscape in which human behavior, objects, and events were intertwined with an unseen order that defied conventional explanation. The parish itself had become a crucible for psychological strain and fascination. Children, acutely aware of patterns and attention, adapted their movements and speech to align with the invisible ledger, often repeating gestures or muttering numbers in imitation of the priest's precise routines. Adults, too, found themselves performing behaviors with careful calculation, hesitant to act spontaneously for fear of disrupting the subtle system in which they were participants. Ordinary social rituals, from greetings to shared meals, were conducted under a heightened awareness of scrutiny, and community life gradually shifted to accommodate the invisible presence that guided perception and interaction. The ordinary rhythms of human activity were now inseparable from the extraordinary influence exerted by Father Albrecht's counting. The psychological burden became evident in the form of heightened anxiety, sleeplessness, and an ongoing preoccupation with minor details that previously would have gone unnoticed. Individuals described a sensation of being silently evaluated, a feeling that their actions were catalogued in a ledger beyond comprehension. Children hesitated before speaking, adults re-examined simple gestures, and entire households adjusted routines in anticipation of scrutiny. Even casual social interactions were colored by subtle calculations, as people internalized the rhythms and rules imposed by the priest's invisible system. Ordinary life had been reshaped, transformed into a delicate balance of observation, prediction, and subtle compliance that reinforced both fear and fascination. Some sought rational explanations, attempting to reconcile Father Albrecht's behavior with logic and empirical observation. Scholars and local clergy debated whether heightened awareness, coincidence, or early forms of psychological influence could account for the phenomena. Others looked to spiritual interpretation, claiming that the priest's methods were manifestations of divine insight, a rare capacity to perceive the moral and spiritual order of human life. Yet no single explanation satisfied all observers. The combination of meticulous counting, precise alignment of objects, repeated coincidences, and the pervasive psychological impact created a sense of mystery that persisted despite rational or theological attempts at resolution. Ordinary understanding had proven insufficient to contain the effects of the extraordinary. Parishioners began to notice a subtle but unmistakable change in the rhythm of the city itself. Streets felt quieter, interactions slower, and ordinary sounds amplified under the weight of shared tension. People began to anticipate patterns in daily life, interpreting mundane occurrences as deliberate or significant within the framework of Father Albrecht's unseen ledger. Every footstep, every exchanged word, every fleeting coincidence was interpreted as evidence of an ongoing, meticulous accounting. The ordinary world was no longer simply a background for life, it had become an extension of the priest's rituals, a living theater in which human behavior, objects, and events intersected with an invisible, omnipresent order. The emotional intensity reached a crescendo as the parish became deeply aware of the priest's dual nature, both revered and feared. Those who remained devout interpreted his methods as a manifestation of sacred insight, a rare capacity to perceive souls and moral alignment with unmatched clarity. Skeptics and the uneasy saw obsession, manipulation, and psychological control, a compulsion that transformed ordinary existence into a labyrinth of subtle scrutiny. The resulting tension created a community suspended between faith and fear, logic and superstition, awe and dread. Ordinary interactions, once casual, were imbued with unspoken significance, leaving each parishioner acutely aware of their place within the invisible structure imposed by the priest. The culmination of these effects was not a dramatic confrontation but a pervasive, enduring transformation. Daily life, social relationships, and even physical spaces had been quietly reshaped under the silent guidance of Father Albrecht's observation and counting. Children and adults alike internalized his meticulous rhythms, subconsciously aligning their actions to an invisible standard. The ordinary world was interlaced with extraordinary patterns, coincidences interpreted as signs, and subtle psychological influence that shaped perception and behavior. Even long after his presence was no longer directly felt, the effects lingered, creating a legacy of caution, heightened awareness, and the pervasive knowledge that human lives had been catalogued, measured, and observed with precision that defied comprehension. By the end of this period, the parish and the surrounding community were irrevocably transformed. Ordinary life had become a landscape in which observation, counting, and subtle ritual intersected with human perception, leaving individuals attuned to patterns, sequences, and coincidences that would previously have passed unnoticed. Social interactions, family routines, and the most mundane acts were all shaped by the invisible ledger that Father Albrecht had created, a system both silent and profoundly influential. The legacy of his meticulous counting endured, leaving lingering questions, whispered legends, and an emotional resonance that persisted across the community, a reminder that ordinary existence could be measured, recorded, and transformed by the patient, unrelenting attention of a single individual.